So if you're on the market for a BI developer or a data analyst role, then you're most likely going to run into Power BI interviews. Well, in this video, I'm going to cover what are the two types of interviews you can face, what are interviewers testing for, and then 50 real Power BI interview questions. And I've also provided a written document that has all the questions and all the answers. So if you want that, you can find that in the description. So without further ado, let's get started. So what are the two types of interviews? The first type is a technical test where they provide you a data set and ask you to build a report. Interview type 2 is when there's a lot of questions and you just have to answer those questions. You either have one of those interviews, sometimes you can get both, but essentially both these interview types are testing on the same thing. You have modeling, Power Query, DAX, and visualization. Now for the question interview, so these are when you're actually asked questions, you can also be asked about the Power BI service. So usually with this interview type, you do not have the time to actually build anything really meaningful. Interviewers just want to see you have an understanding of the four components I mentioned. So how do you do that in 30 minutes to an hour? For data modeling, if they provide you a data set, you can create one dimension table. I have a great video on fact and dimensions, but essentially just creating one dimension table from the data set they provide shows that you understand modeling. So tick off your modeling and move straight to Power Query. No matter what data set they give you, there's probably some transformations you can do. So first check your data types, that's always something to check. Things like renaming columns, and if you can do any concatenations or do other transformations such as splitting columns, then make sure you do those. It's a great way to show that you understand Power Query and how it can be used to transform data. Top tip, make sure not to do any joins or actually merges of tables. If they've provided you multiple files, they're not looking for you to join them in Power Query. They're most likely looking at relationships in the desktop view. So the third thing that you have to demonstrate is DAX. So once you load that data in, build your baseline calculations very quickly. Your sum, count, average, get those three out of the way. Now after that, demonstrate the calculate function. This is very important as calculate is often used, and by doing that function, you're showing a slightly higher level knowledge of DAX now. So do the calculate function, and so let's say you have a sum of cells, do that function and filter that to one particular area. So that's your calculation number 2. Then do an if statement, or even better if you can use switch. Those are 3 calculations that you must have in there, which shows a high level of understanding of Power BI. And if you can, use an iterator function. But those are the 4 things that you can show in terms of DAX, and you can do quite quickly. So you have your basic aggregations, you have a calculate function and an if statement. And then if you get time, you can do an iterator function, but leave that to last. So that's your sum x or an average x. And the 4th element now is visualization. They're not expecting you to build a complete dashboard, but what you can do is build a couple of visuals. So always start off with your cards and put your basic calculations in there. So your sum, count, average, put that into card visuals. After you've done that, create one line chart and then one bar chart. By covering these 4 elements, you've demonstrated that you understand Power BI as a whole. So that's interview type number 1. So now I will move on to interview type 2. So these are the common questions that you might be asked. So now I will cover 50 Power BI interview questions that are frequently asked with the answers. If you'd like the supporting material, so these are the slides that have the questions, check the description, there should be a download link to the file there. So without further ado, let's get started. So what is Power BI? Power BI is Microsoft's business intelligence or data visualization tool, where you have a large volume of data and you might need to automate that or build some governance around it and provide that in reports and dashboards. Power BI comes into play. Power BI is a very powerful tool that allows you to work with very large data sets, and it can do a lot of calculations and automate that, send reports, etc. What are the main components of Power BI? Power BI essentially consists of 2 components. You have Power BI Desktop and the Power BI Service. And alongside that, you have the Power BI Gateway, you have Report Builder, and you have Power BI Mobile, but I don't really consider that a tool, more functionality. But essentially, Power BI Desktop is your local application or report development tool. So this is where you will actually build your reports, do your calculations, and whilst you can build data flows and do things in the service, Power BI Desktop right now is primarily for report development, and that's your local environment just for yourself. Now the Power BI service, this is where you can share and distribute content. So we have the concept of workspaces. This is where you can publish workspaces and actually share your reports. And then we have apps, etc. And you can actually build data flows and actually load data into the service and do some report changes, etc. But primarily the Power BI service, as is right now, is for sharing content. What are the different types of licenses for Power BI? As soon as you start sharing reports, this is where licensing comes into play. So we have Pro, and essentially that's about $10 a month, and that's an individual user license to access and make data sets in this Power BI service. Then we have Premium per user. So this is where you start to get some premium features, and I'll get onto premium. But premium per user essentially means you get a premium workspace, so you can create one and the users can access it. And this is where you have some additional functionality like deployment pipelines, larger data set sizes, etc. And the third licensing type is Power BI Premium, or now it's known as Microsoft Fabric. And essentially that's a capacity-based licensing. So you're not paying for users, well you are for developers, but you're not paying for viewers that just view reports. What you're getting is a capacity, so dedicated compute power essentially for your Power BI and the refreshes to support it. And additionally now you're getting Fabric. So this is things like One Lake and building pipelines, etc. It's a lot more complicated than before, but that's essentially the free tiers. What is DAX? DAX essentially stands for Data Analysis Expressions. So this is the calculation language used in Power BI. So once you've actually loaded that data and you start to perform your calculations, so things like sums, counts, averages, and more complex things as well, DAX is the language that we use in desktop in the report view. What types of data sources can Power BI connect to? So Power BI has a range of data sources it can connect to. So starting from your more obvious and common ones like SQL Server, SharePoint, Excel, CSV files, it has all of those. And then it has more bespoke connectors for certain platforms and tools. So things like Salesforce, Synapse, Data Lake, Amazon. There's a range of connectors that we can use in Power BI. So we have quite a few. So how do we connect the data in Power BI? So we have the get data option, and from that option, we have a range of different connectors that we can choose. So for example, with SQL Server, you choose that connector, list your server and your database. And if you want a query, then you can begin to start loading that data in. What is import mode? So once you connect to your data and you need to start pulling that in, import mode essentially means that data will be imported and stored in memory. So there's not a real-time connection, that's import mode. So direct query is the complete opposite of import mode. So instead of loading that data and storing it in memory, direct query is a live connection to your data source. So if there's an update in your data source, it will start to reflect in your report. So the data is not physically stored in the memory of the dataset or the Power BI dataset. So with direct query, you don't have to do refreshes. That connection is in real time. It can be quite heavy on your server or your backend data source. So you have to very much optimize your models with direct query and do a lot of transformations upstream so you don't have to do any in Power BI. So with Power BI, can you connect to different data sources at the same time? How does that work? So yes, Power BI can connect to many different data sources. So if you have a database as one data source and then you have an Excel file as another, you can load those two data sources into the report and they'll work completely fine. Similar with import and direct query. You can have both types of data in the report, and this is referred to as a hybrid model. It might be another name, I don't remember if I'm honest. So now that we've gone over the basics of Power BI as a tool, we're now going to move on to transformations and modeling. So you've loaded your data now, and it's gone into Power Query. What is that? Power Query is the kitchen for your data. So once you've loaded that in, usually you have to apply some transformations, you might have to do some data cleansing, or you might have to shape it in a way for your reporting. Power Query allows you to do a lot of functions. It allows you to model your data, rename columns, split columns, do concatenations, a lot of transformations to prep your data. This is what Power Query allows. Explain the difference between calculated columns and measures. Calculated columns are similar to measures in a sense where they use DAX, but they're very different in how they store their data and how they perform the calculation. Calculated columns are stored in memory, so it will physically store your data row by row, so the result of your calculation. DAX stores it in memory, but it's not physical storage at a row by row level, storing that data. Only when it's referenced in a visual, that's when it will be called and performed in terms of the calculation. So calculated columns are stored in memory, measures are not. What are relationships in Power BI? So relationships essentially allow you to build connections between tables so you don't have to do a lot of joins. They allow you to build those connections, and those are referred to as relationships. So then what are the different types of relationships? So you have three types of relationships in Power BI. You have many-to-many, many-to-one, and one-to-one. Many-to-many means you do not have unique values between the two columns that you're joining or doing a relationship on. So let's say you have a product ID list and a product ID list in both tables. If they're not unique and you have multiple of the same products appearing with the same IDs on both sides, that's referred to as many-to-many. One-to-many essentially means on one side you have a unique list of IDs, so a primary key, and then the other side of your table you have a foreign key, so it's not a unique list of IDs. So it will build that one-to-many relationship. And one-to-one essentially means you have a unique ID list on one side and you have a unique ID list on the other. When you join, there's a one-to-one match between the two. So you understand the concept of relationships. What is a star schema? So a star schema essentially means where you have a fact table, so all your aggregations and your things that you'll do calculations on, things like balance, cost, orders, temperature, anything that you might actually do a calculation and put into the y-axis of a visual. So these are things that you actually want to report on, so they're not descriptive, they go into your fact table. Dimensions tend to be descriptive data, so things like product name, region, business group, anything that's descriptive or you might group data by, that tends to be known as a dimension table. And I've got a dedicated video on star schema and fact and dimensions, feel free to check that out. So moving away from Power Query and modeling, let's move on to DAX. So what is the calculate function? So calculate is one of the most fundamental calculations in Power BI. What it allows you to do is, let's say you have a expression, so this is basic calculation, for example, sum of sales, and then you want to modify the filter context. So you want to adjust that expression based on a particular filter. This is when calculate comes in. So the second part of the calculate expression allows you to modify the filter context. It's a very powerful function when it comes to DAX. What are iterator functions and how do they differ from their non-iterator counterparts? So for example, SUMX versus sum. So iterator functions are very different in a sense where they go row by row when performing the calculation. So let's say we have orders and then we have sales. When you use a SUMX, it will return the result at a row by row level. So you have 10 cells, it will perform that calculation at a row by row level where you can then do things and additional calculations on top of that. Non-iterator functions, so things like sum, they get the total result and then are modified by your filter context in your visuals. So that's the difference between iterator functions and normal calculations. What does the all function do? Sure, so the all function is very powerful. It allows you to remove all filter context from a particular table. So for example, so let's say you had a column which is called sales. If you did a sum and then remove the filter context using all, you would get the same result in every single row. So it's very powerful when you're doing things like division, etc., working out totals and percentages. The all function is very powerful. What does the use relationship function do? Sure, so when you have multiple relationships in a model, you might have to build relationships from multiple date columns. So they might be order date and then ship date. When you want to do a calculation on one of those particular relationships, and one might be active and the other might be inactive. So the use relationship function allows you to pick which relationship to use and activate that for a particular calculation. So let's move on to visualization. So Power BI has a range of visualizations. Can you name some of your most commonly used ones? Sure, so I often use matrix tables because they allow you to split your rows into different columns. So that's very good for reporting dates, months, etc., or different categories. I also use line charts quite often. Card visuals, they're very good for key metrics that you can present on a page, and bar charts. There's a lot of metrics, but I often see those ones used quite commonly. Okay, so you know your visualizations. What is a slicer in Power BI? Okay, so slicers allow you to filter your data. So you have your visuals. You might want your users to be able to select a business group or a region or a month. This is where slicers come in and they allow you to adjust those different things. You can have multiple selections, single selections. Slicers essentially are to do. So can you explain to me what is a drill through? Sure, so drill throughs are slightly different from drill downs, where what they do is they allow you to let's say you have a visual, they allow you to go into another page. So you select a particular product, you can then draw through to another page, which is then filtered by what you initially selected. And that page is a completely another report page. So it's really good for breaking down more detail, but across a lot of different metrics instead of a drill down, which is just specific to that one visual. What are bookmarks in Power BI? Well, bookmarks allow you to do that where you create different states, and that allows you to switch over to different states and retain your filters. So things like changing visuals, changing slices, even creating snapshots or predefined filters, it's really good at doing that. Bookmarks are all to do with creating states and then choosing states to switch between. So moving on to some advanced features, what is row level security? Row level security essentially means when you have a data set and you want to add some privacy to certain elements of it. So let's say you have different teams. So you have a sales data set and you have different teams. You don't want, let's say, marketing to see what consumer can see, and you don't want consumer to see what marketing can see. So row level security allows you to create different profiles and groups, apply that to your data set. And if you need to test it, you can test your different roles, but essentially it's all about creating privacy with your data and securing it for different groups. Moving away from desktop, we have this thing called a Power BI gateway. What is that? Sure, so we have two types of gateways. We have a standard and an enterprise gateway. The reason for that is, let's say we have data stored within our own SQL servers, or essentially within our own network. So when we pull that data, we need to make sure that it's secure, hence why networking comes into play. Well, the Power BI service and where you publish your reports is hosted by Microsoft. When you have to do refreshes, that data from your source has to travel to the Power BI service. Well, we want to make sure that's done in a secure manner. For that transfer to happen, you require a Power BI gateway. A Power BI gateway is essentially a bridge between on-prem, so locked down data in your network, to the Power BI service or any cloud platform, and a gateway allows you to bridge that connection so the data travels through that secure sort of pathway. So your source, Power BI gateway, allows it to go through to the Power BI service. So what are Power BI apps then? Power BI apps are a way of packaging your content and then sharing that with your users. So you have workspaces. Apps are slightly different where they sit on top of workspaces where you can choose and select which reports to show, and then you can create groups and securely package that into a nice UI where they can't see the data sets. They have a nice link to an app with a collection of the chosen reports and dashboards in that workspace. How can you optimize your Power BI report or dataset performance? You have good models of fact and dimensions. You can avoid using calculated columns and using measures, so that will reduce your model size, and remove the unnecessary data. So only have the columns that you need. Don't have unnecessary data in your report. That's a great way to ensure better performance in your data sets. What is query folding in Power BI? Query folding is very important when it comes to your refresh speeds. Essentially, when you do your transformations in Power Query, so things like renaming columns, removing them, etc., Power BI will try to write that as SQL in the backend. So when it goes back to your server or wherever your data source is, it tries to convert that into SQL. Now, when you do transformations that are, let's say, it's not complex, but when they don't follow a particular order or done in the right manner, that SQL can't be written. So what that means is it's not as efficient. So the query doesn't fold, it doesn't actually get written properly, it can't be written. So you've broken the fold, and that can make your refresh times a lot worse. And essentially that's what query folding is. So how do you publish a report to the Power BI service? Well, in Power BI Desktop, it's very simple. You make your changes, save the file, and you can click the publish button. That will publish your report to the Power BI service. And particularly, you have to choose a workspace, and then it will go into the service. What is a dashboard in Power BI? Dashboards and reports are often confused. A dashboard is a collection of different visuals and metrics from reports. So let's say in Power BI Desktop, you're building one report, you publish that. So that's the sales report. And then you might build another report called marketing. You publish that to the same workspace. When you want to build, let's say, a summary dashboard of data of different metrics from different reports, this is when you can create a dashboard. So it's selecting different metrics from different reports. They can all go into a dashboard. Very simple to do. How do you schedule data refreshes? So to schedule a refresh, you can go to the data set, map your gateway connections if it's an on-prem data source, or if it's in the cloud, you can put in the credentials and then refresh your data set. What is the Power BI admin portal? Sure, so the Power BI admin portal is where you can access all your reports. So it has a collection of all the reports and workspaces in the tenant. It allows you to edit your tenant settings. So these are things like publish to web, can users analyze data in Excel, can people send PDFs? There's a lot of features to admin settings and how the actual Power BI tenant is set up. That can be done in the admin center. So how would you go about managing access in Power BI? So by default in Power BI, you have 4 types of roles. You have viewer, contributor, member, and admin. They all have different roles. So a viewer can just access reports. A contributor can edit data sets, essentially is the developer of the workspace. A member is someone who's managing that workspace and has a few elevated permissions. So things like adding people and removing them. So viewers and contributors. And an admin is the highest level. So they can delete the workspace and do everything that other people can as well. So you have data from 2 different sources that we need to combine. It's the same data, but slightly messy. How would you go about making it align? So the first thing that I'll do is take a look at the 2 data sources and see where there's alignment between them. So if there's various columns, we need to ensure, okay, are they aligned and do they match? And the ones that don't, we need to remove and then communicate that with whoever the stakeholders are, but first identify where it aligns. From there, I'll look at things like the data types, make sure the column names are the same, etc. We want to make our reports more user-friendly. We don't want our users to go to different pages to find the same data but in different visuals. How would you maybe go about making that user experience better? Sure, so there's potentially 2 things we can do. We can look at bookmarks to potentially create states and then allow users to change their visuals based on a selection, or we can look at field parameters where we can have different metrics or columns and the users can select and change the visuals based on those selections. So we have a dataset that has 100 million rows. It's quite slow. What can you do to make that more efficient in Power BI? Sure, so that's quite a large data set. So before we actually load that data, we need to first look at that data set and ensure we're only bringing in what we need, so there's no unnecessary data in our model. The second thing that we need to do, any calculations that we'll need to do later for our reporting, are we doing that as upstream as possible? So if there's any columns that we need to create, any particular views or slices, can we create bespoke views upstream instead of loading that into Power BI and then doing it? And I've mentioned this slightly, but ensuring that we don't have a SQL query in our reports and we potentially have a table or a view. So that will take the load off our Power Query onto our source backend. So we want live updates of the data in our database. How would you do that? Sure, so if we need that in real time, we have to look at direct query. Direct query allows us to see our data in real time. But there is another option depending on how quickly we need that information. With Power BI, we can set alerts, and if data is changed, we can actually alert on that. And with Power BI, we can refresh up to 8 times, or if we have premium per user or premium, we could do 48 times. So that way we could keep refreshing our data and do it in 15-minute intervals, for example, and build those alerts. So that's another option, but it really depends on how real time you need that data. So what are variables? Sure, so variables are slightly different from measures where they only exist in the calculation that they're written in. And what they essentially do is they allow you to perform a calculation and store that result in a variable. And then later you can reference that in your calculation as you go down after your return, where you reference that variable and that result as part of another calculation. So we're looking to install a Power BI gateway. What are some considerations and things that we need to think of? Sure, so with a gateway, we need to consider how many reports we may have and what our refresh volumes might look like. And with that, we can determine, do we need a small size VM because we don't have many reports, or do we need to really start looking at failovers and a cluster to support a lot of reports? So looking at your user base and where you are is very important to determine what spec machines that you need.